warm welcome from me, colleagues. Thank you for joining us today. It's lovely to see you, and this is our final session of the year. It should have been our Deputies Heads Conference today, those of you who would have been booked onto that. I really hope that heads and deputies that are with us have had, found these seminars or these webinars over the summer term, the Thinking Forward webinars, useful and inspirational. And it's such a shame we can't be together face to face, but fingers crossed for next year we will be. But thank you for joining us anyway. Just a couple of things from me before we start the session off. As colleagues hopefully know, we are giving you all a £15 book voucher to use at Crown House for colleagues that are part of the Senior Leaders Network or have bought into the Thinking Forward series. Debra Kidd, who's our wonderful speaker today, her book is available at Curriculum of Hope. She's going to be telling us a lot more about that during the session today. You can, if you want to use your voucher to buy that book, I would absolutely recommend it if you're interested in some inspiring summer reading. So please do look out for that, and I'll resend the voucher code to you after the session today in case you've lost that code. I'm going to jump really ahead now, but I will be putting a link into the chat at the end, and Lisa will be sending an email to everybody with the feedback form for today. But it's an important one this time because this is our last session of the year for the Senior Leaders Network. It is the review of the whole year. So you know how much I really appreciate your feedback in terms of helping to guide our programme next academic year. Tell us what you found has worked well for you this year, how we can further develop it and how we can improve things for the future. And please do let me know, and I'll pop, as I say, a link into that feedback form right at the end. In terms of next year, hopefully you will have all seen our subscriptions for next academic year. Those have been sent out to schools now. Please do pop onto the website or contact us in the office if you're interested in subscribing for next academic year. We're really pleased to have been able to offer the Senior Leaders Network an additional add-on of the DRB Senior Leader briefings, which I know colleagues joined us, I think it was last week, 25th of June anyway, for the TASER session for that. And lots of people have been really positive about how useful those are. So hopefully you'll find it's a combined package, hopefully really good value for money and hopefully really supportive to you as senior leaders as well. So look out for that. And obviously our Maths, English, Senko, early years and our curriculum programme and School Business Managers Network, that's all there and available for next academic year. There's an early bird discount. So if you subscribe before the end of term, then you can get 10% off. And there's also discounts for small schools, and recommend a friend if you know of a school that you feel would benefit from buying in but don't currently. So please do check out those details. I'll send some more information on the follow-up email after today, but please do look out for those things. Just in terms of the session, as normal, if you keep your microphones off whilst the session's running, that's really helpful. But obviously, as I say, if you want to keep your cameras on, that's wonderful too. I'm really delighted, as I say, to welcome Debra Kidd to come and lead our session for us today, our final session today, and I think it's going to be a really inspiring webinar. So Debra's got a huge amount of experience, taught in every age group from nursery all the way through to postgraduate, and still enjoys working very closely with teachers and leaders in schools every day or very regularly. She's got a doctorate in education and co-founded the organisation Northern Rocks, that really well-known and hugely popular teachers conference, and a huge amount of sort of hybrid things that have come off Northern Rocks. I saw recently, Wales Rocks, is it coming up in September? So that's really exciting too. And obviously an author of very many books. And I've talked about the book we're focusing on today, The Curriculum of Hope. Really excited to understand and really delve into Debra's thinking in terms of that book. I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to steal any more thunder, but I'm going to hand straight over to you, Debra, now, and look forward to your session this morning. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. I can't imagine there's always end of term tiredness at the summer, but I can't imagine what this end of term tiredness looks like for you at the moment. So the fact that your eyes are open and that you're actually smiling is amazing to me. I'm going to share my screen and talk to you a little bit about what this curriculum of hope might look like. And probably, I'm not sure that we've ever needed it any more than we need it right now. For me, it goes all the way back to my childhood when, my granddad, who wasn't really a Werther's original granddad, let's say, he wasn't about one for bouncing his grandchildren on his knee. He was quite a grumpy old chap. But he had fought in the First World War. He'd signed up way too young. He then married his childhood sweetheart, having returned from the First World War, with none of his friends having survived. He lost his wife shortly after their first child was born, and then lost that first child in the Second World War. So by the time he'd met my grandma, and he was my granddad, it's quite understandable why he wasn't your Werther's original granddad. He was a traumatized man. And I remember going around when I was about 8 years old, thinking that, I just wanted to connect with him. And they lived in a council house in the north of England. And my grandma was one of those women, although they didn't have much, but she was so house proud, she'd like whitewash the doorstep so she didn't bring shame on the family. And yet their garden was a bit of a mess. It was full of weeds. And I'd gone round with a little trowel. I was getting quite into my gardening at that age. And I'd gone around with a little trowel thinking I'd dig up some weeds and I'd tidy the garden and maybe my granddad would be impressed with me. And he came out with a face like thunder and told me to stop it, and then sat down. And it's the only time he ever talked to me about the war. But he said that when he was that young man in the trenches, looking out over just acres, miles of mud and destruction, that seeing a small flower popping its head through that mud, a dandelion, a buttercup, whatever it was what gave him the will to carry on. And that he would never, ever pull up something that had given him that much hope when he was in that situation. And it just stayed with me for the rest of my life. And when I was teaching, I was thinking about it a little bit and thinking, how do we as teachers be that for children? How are we those little flashes of colour for children? And how do we bring experiences into children's lives that make them believe that there's hope in the future? And so it's become a little bit of a mantra for me, and it kind of sits there with my granddad, in the past. But I think probably this year we've needed it more than ever, and we've got to be those weeds growing through the cracks in the concrete that have been placed on the shoulders of our children and ourselves over the past year. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that might look like, how it might be. I'm only going to mention the O word once, and that's now. And I think probably, I'm not sure what words I could use to describe how Ofsted have been in the past year, but they wouldn't be very complimentary, and they'd probably not get past a censor on the BBC. So I'm not going to say that. But if we just sort of step back from that for a moment and think, we are all facing a world where sooner or later we're going to be going back into this, being held accountable for this new framework. What can we take from it that still is congruent with our values, that still gives us hope? Is there anything in this framework that gives us that possibility of hope? And I think there is, in spite of everything. I think if we just focus on the good points in the Ofsted framework, and like I say, this is the only time I'm going to mention it, the idea that children should have an entitlement to a broad and balanced curriculum, that we should perhaps refocus our attention away from, the sort of relentless focus that we have had on English and maths. It's not a bad thing. And I think we can complain about the fact that the reason we had that relentless focus was in part because of Ofsted and in part because of SATs, pressure of SATs tests and so on and so forth. But the intention of a broad and balanced curriculum is a good thing. There's an emphasis on this idea of coherence and sense making, which I'm going to pick up on in a lot more detail as we go through. But again, that's a good thing. Children should have a sense of coherence as they walk through their curriculum. Things should connect together. The Year 4 teacher should know what they've learned in Year 2, and the Year 6 teacher know what they did in early years, because there should be this through line through. And I think that actually asking us to think about that, again, is no bad thing. And then there's this constant refrain in the framework about cultural capital. I don't think they really mean cultural capital, because if they did, they'd be like using a radical socialist or Marxist term, and I'm not sure that Ofsted's really sitting in that space right now. But I think what they did mean was cultural literacy. And in thinking about cultural literacy, what they're saying to us is children need to feel rooted in the culture of their society and all aspects of the culture of that society, although it seems a little bit elitist sometimes in the framework. But, you know, a child should feel like no matter what background they came from, whether they, you know, walked out of my grandma and granddad's house and into an art gallery or into a theatre or into a museum or onto a beach or through a forest, that they belong there, that they have a right to be there, that this culture, these experiences exist for them. And it's not always easy for children to feel that. So we have to give them those experiences. And then there's the ability for children to feel like they understand how the world connects and the people in the world and how those meanings in the world are communicated through the cultures that we have. And those are good things for us to think about. They're good things for us to focus on. And if we ignore all the kind of, or try to just push the rubbish to the back of our minds, I think, you know, focusing on this and the next set of questions I'm just going to bring up are not a bad way to go forward. I think simply in terms of being held accountable to all this, we just need to know and be clear and be able to articulate what exactly it is we want children to know, what experiences we want them to have, how we're going to achieve it, so the pedagogical approach we're going to take to this, and then being able to evaluate it, reflect on it, assess it. And I don't mean measure it, I mean, you know, to be able to tell the story of our successes in ways that aren't just numerical or about achieving expected standards. So if we can sort of answer these questions and have conversations around these questions, I think rather than thinking about an Ofsted framework, we're just thinking about what is good practice in schools. And I think there's lots of ways we can really expand our thinking around this. So if any of you have ever heard my colleague and friend Hal Roberts speak, you'll have come across this picture before. And he talks about his experiences in his early teaching career of how he defaulted to this model of a pedagogy of poverty. Martin Haberman, the American educationalist, has written several books and articles, but one of them was about this pedagogy of poverty, in which he talks about how children, particularly from disadvantaged communities, who are under high levels of surveillance and accountability from outside forces, and I bet that sounds familiar to us, how they end up being dragged through a curriculum by fearful staff who feel they have to tick boxes and cross T's and dot I's, and perhaps sometimes lose sight of the journey itself at the expense of the end point. So what he talks about is how, you know, for children who come from very affluent backgrounds or middle class backgrounds, parents will often make up the deficit that schools can't provide. But for these children, all they get is the pedagogy of poverty. So what we're talking about today is perhaps moving more towards this idea of a pedagogy of power. And a pedagogy of power is where children feel empowered to be agents of change. They feel that they can have an impact on their world. They feel that they've got a say in what they learn and how they learn it, without completely, you know, sort of being a discovery-led curriculum. The teacher's in control of this, but it's about empowering the children to feel like they're agents of change, so that they don't leave school thinking that they keep the world the same. They leave school thinking that they can be the difference that needs to be made. And we know now there's absolutely no doubt that these children are going to face a challenging future well beyond the pandemic in terms of climate change and so many other things. We've got to be so careful that that area of the curriculum and those issues that sit around conservation don't become a curriculum of trauma for children. And it's very quick, it's very easy for that to happen. So we've got to think about empowerment, we've got to think about solutions, we've got to think about positivity and hope and find that in the curriculum. And hopefully my examples will show you how that can be done. So when I was writing the book Curriculum of Hope, you know, people had been saying to me, how do you get your ideas for the curriculum? You know, what are you thinking about when you go into the planning stages? And I was thinking, you know what, I've never really given it much thought. I just do it. So I started stripping it back and I thought, what are the really important things about the kinds of ways that I approach this work? And it seemed to be summarized in these, you know, conveniently alliterative 5 C's. And one of them offered by Ofsted there. The idea of coherence is really important. I've just said, a child entering early years and going right the way through to year 6 and beyond needs to see how things develop and build. And that's a bit about progression of skills and knowledge, but it's also about the coherence of big ideas. So, for example, Claire Seeley offers a really lovely example of, if you want children to understand the way that countries are governed and led, in the world, one of the concepts that they have to consider is the concept of tyrannies and dictatorships and all those kinds of things. And then they might move on to looking at things like democracies. But how do you do that in terms of introducing these ideas in a coherent way across the curriculum? And she offers this lovely example of, in early years, they're playing with dinosaurs. They've got their lovely small world area and they've got a lovely unit on dinosaurs. And the teacher just drops into the conversation around a Tyrannosaurus Rex, that the word tyrannosaur means terrible lizard. The saur is the lizard, the tyrann is the tyrant, the terrible lizard. And that word is just dropped into their consciousness. And then when they're in year 1 or 2, maybe they encounter somebody like King John and they talk about this tyrannical king. Maybe when they're in year 5 or 6, they may encounter Macbeth in a Shakespeare play. They encounter Hitler. And so this word tyrant starts to echo up through the curriculum in a way that just starts to get the children thinking about this one aspect of governance. So when we're thinking about coherence of ideas for children, we're not just thinking about, a math skill building on a math skill, or an English skill building on an English skill, or, an understanding of mapping developing across the curriculum. Those things are important. I'll give more examples of some of those later, but it's about coherence of ideas as well. And then there's credibility. And I think I might have been a bit defensive when I called it credibility. I should have called it content, but I must have had a row on Twitter with somebody accusing me of not liking knowledge or something. So I called it credibility. And the credibility is what we want children to know. What is it that we absolutely want to nail down and for children to know and to be able to do? And we've got to be quite careful here, because our default setting as teachers, when we gather around a table, we've got all our, either phase teachers or year teachers, if you're more than one form entry, gathered around a table, and they go, we're doing, because we say that, don't we? We're doing the Romans, we're doing the Victorians, and you write Victorians in the middle of the paper, and then you just kind of brainstorm every possible thing you could learn about the Victorians, put it into a document or a knowledge organizer, and it goes on your school website. And then reality hits when you're teaching it, because you forgot about the nativity play and harvest, and then there's swimming on this day. And you actually don't end up teaching everything you said you were going to teach. And then some Ofsted inspector comes in and asks the child a question from your curriculum planning document that you haven't actually had time to teach. Like for one poor year 2 teacher, it was, can you name Queen Victoria's children? And she's going, what? But it was there on the curriculum document. So just be really careful when you're planning through that content that you nail down the things you think are important and leave enough space between for other things that the children can bring to the table. And that's there in your evaluation, in your assessment. Then compassion. We're quite good, I think we're pretty good in primary at getting children to think compassionately. We introduce them to loads of stories. Some of us use SEAL time, some of us use P for C, some of us use drama for empathy. There's loads of ways that we do this in primary school. But one thing we've got to be careful of is that sometimes we get a bit carried away. As I just said, that pedagogy for trauma or that curriculum for trauma, we can sometimes get a bit carried away for that and forget that children can become overloaded. They can have compassion fatigue if everything they're introduced to is somebody in a mess. So we've got to start thinking about how can the curriculum be compassionate towards the children? And for me, that's about agency. It's about finding opportunities to give children the chance to make changes, to intervene, to solve a problem. And then it's also thinking, how compassionate is our curriculum towards the children? Are we taking them out for extra intervention in English and maths and taking them out of subjects things like art, music, sports activities that we know are really good for their mental health? You know, is that compassionate? Is our curriculum compassionate towards our staff? Is it creating a load of extra workload, a load of extra worry? How can we relieve that a little bit? So the compassion runs two ways. Creativity is about not just going, we're doing the Romans, so we'll make a mosaic, or we're doing the Vikings, we'll make a shield. It's not about whacking in an arts day or an arts week and then thinking that you've done the creative bit. Creativity for children is a habit of mind, and it exists in a space where you're using your imagination to solve a problem or to meet a brief or to achieve, some kind of goal, by utilizing information you already have, acquiring new information, and combining them in an unusual way to create something new. So yes, they need knowledge for creativity, but they need the space and opportunity to be grappling with that difficulty and generating new ideas. And then community is about how we bring the walls of our school down a little bit. And it's not just about taking children on trips and connecting with our local museums and galleries and theatres and zoos and anything else, but it's also about how can we bring our community into the school so that they're part of that school. And hopefully I'll give you lots of examples of that in the future, as I go through. But for me, that's really important, because sometimes we've ended up with a kind of narrative of social mobility for children, which suggests to them that the place they come from is bad and the best thing they can do in life is escape it. And we've got to be really careful about that, because what we do in that is hollow out communities and make them even more impoverished. Whereas what we should be doing is trying to build pride in our communities, connections in our communities, networks within our communities, and giving children the opportunity to practice their power within those communities to help connect and shape them. So again, I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. The only other thing I wanted to just tap into as well was this work by Ron Berger. And if any of you have ever seen that lovely little film, Austin's Butterfly, Ron Berger is the teacher going, here is the story of Austin's Butterfly. And he talks in his book about leaders of their own learning, this idea of hierarchies of audience. And what he says is that for the vast majority of children, for most of the time, the only person who sees their work is their teacher. And they may or may not be motivated by that, but they may all put in loads of effort for their teacher, or they may not. And you'll know when you look at children's books whether that's true or not. But it's almost like sometimes children get to the point of, well, what's the point of doing this? Because only one person's ever going to see it. And then we try and broaden it out and we say, well, do you know what? We'll get parents in. We'll get parents in for a day. They can look at the children's work. We'll have a parents' assembly. We might even broaden that out and have a school community event where the children share their work across the school community. And the problem is that both of those audiences tend to respond only with applause, and praise, because parents are a very uncritical audience and they want their children to feel good. So they'll respond very positively, which is not a bad thing for children's self-esteem, but it's not very good for their critique of their work. And similarly with the school community, when we share that work, they tend to get people going, oh, that was great, thank you, we really enjoyed that. But beyond that, there are these two areas that are really highly motivating for children. One of them is introducing children to professionals who are capable of critique. And by that, I don't think he means that teachers are incapable of critique, but I think what he means is people external to the school in the community who can offer professional critique of children's work. So for example, with year 2, when I was doing Great Fire of London, doing the Great Fire of London, we were redesigning the baker's house. His daughter Hannah had come to us, it's just me and Roll, talking about how burned my arms were, how devastated our family was, at this fire, and that how important it was for her to see her father's business back up on its feet because he was really struggling. And so the children are all empathetic and they want to help the baker rebuild his house, and they're redesigning it in line with the new building regulations that have come in. Now, I'm not an architect, so I bring in an architect, and an architect can say to the children, well, this would work, this wouldn't work, this is structurally sound, this isn't. And that feedback, even just to year twos, was really memorable for them and important. What I noticed was they started grappling for that professional language because they wanted to impress the architect. So it has an impact on vocabulary, it has an impact on behaviour, it has an impact on sense of pride in their work. And then at the top of it, Berger talks of being of service to the world and to our communities. And that's where children have made a tangible difference within their communities, where they feel like they've changed the world, even perhaps in a small way. Now, we can't do that for every single piece of work. Imagine, if every single bit of homework we ever set had to be of service to the world, we'd all die. But we can try and do it every now and then, and we can do it in a meaningful way. So I'm going to share with you some examples of how that's happened. And this was this year. This is year 3. Now, I'm not teaching. I'm not even going to pretend that I've had a year like you've had. I'm not teaching full time in a school, but I did before Christmas, just because people were on the knees and desperate, go in and teach just to when people couldn't put staff in front of kids. And I went into this school, and I'd been working with them already on developing their curriculum. So I kind of inherited my own unit, and it was put to the test. And it was year 3, and we had to do local area study. We were looking at a combined local geography and local history study. And so I'm standing in the class with these children. I know I can't actually take them out on the trips that I wanted to, or that we'd initially intended and planned to. But, I am so sorry. That's my phone going off, and I'm just going to literally switch it off. So here we are in a year 3 class. And I say to the children, what do you call people who sell houses? And they say they had no idea. They were saying house sellers, and I'm going, that would be a sensible name for them, wouldn't it? That'd be a really sensible name. But no, they're called estate agents. I wonder what that means. So we unpicked a little bit, what an estate is, what an agent does. And then we think about the roles and responsibilities that somebody who had to do that job might have to do. So they're saying to me things like, they'd be good at measuring things. They'd be good at describing things. They have to be honest, but positive. They might have to be good at drawing, because they might have to do floor plans and things like that. So we come up with a list of all the attributes that a good estate agent might have. And I said, what's special about our estate agency is that we care as much about the people as the houses. So we really look after people. And they were like, they got behind that, and they were going, yes, we do. And we're very good at that. And we're very responsible. And so when we got an email from our client, the children were primed to understand what an estate agent did. And the email from our client came from Australia. And it was from a lady called Jenny. And she said that she needed the help of our estate agency. And she was really hoping we'd do a good job, because she'd heard that we care as much about people as we do about houses. And her dad had to go into a care home. He'd reached a point in his life where he could no longer cope with the house that he'd been born in and lived in all his life and loved. And that she was very sad because she's his only child and she lives in Australia. And because of the pandemic, she can't travel to help him. So she was hoping that not only would we sell his house, but that we'd do such a good job that he didn't feel so sad about leaving it. So we've got this sense of responsibility going into this task. And then I bring up this picture. We would have gone for a walk around the local area because this house is in our local area, but we couldn't. So I bring up this picture and we stand in front of it and the children are going, oh, that needs a lot of work. Oh, who's been throwing the rubbish over that fence? Oh dear. It looks a bit of a wreck. And I say, well, we might think that, but we can't really say it. We've got to be positive. So let's think about the positives here. And one of the things I want to assess the children on is their ability to do an aerial drawing. We've talked about, because obviously in terms of developing children's mapping skills, the first thing they need to understand is what the world looks like from above. It's one of the reasons why children who live in high-rise buildings are better at doing mapping than children who live on the ground. So in early years, what I'd say to you is get children up, get them on climbing frames, get them on top of slides, get them looking down at objects and thinking about what they look like from above. And that's an introduction to mapping skills. By the time they get to year 3, I'm hoping that if I say to them, we want to do an aerial drawing of this building, they can start to conceptualize that. They can think about the paths, what they look like from above, the boundary, the fence, the shape of the building, how that's going to be sort of, you know, in scale or in proportion to the rest of the drawing, where are the main trees and so on and so forth. Most of the children manage it, not all, but most of the children manage that. We get some aerial drawings together. And then we go to the front door and we've written a list, we've written an inventory of all the equipment we might need to take in. We've been told that the old man has gone, that he's gone to his care home and the house is empty and the electricity has been switched off. So the children have got, like, we've got torches, we've got measuring tapes, we've got cameras, we've got our clipboards with pens and paper so we can make notes of what we see when we go in. And we open the door. And we stand in the hallway and I'm narrating away about the dust motes catching on the shafts of sunlight coming through the windows, the parquet flooring, the grand staircase that goes off in 2 directions because the house is so big. When all of a sudden this little boy goes, oh, and I've got my ghost busting machine. And I'm going, you've got your what? And I'm thinking, oh, for heaven's sake, here, we don't want a ghost busting machine. It's not a ghost story, but I don't say that. You don't say that, do you, to children? So I went, have you now? You've got a ghost busting machine. And what's that for? And he said, it's for ghosts, as if I was stupid. And I'm like, okay, but what does it do? And he said, it goes beep, 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 if there's a ghost nearby. And I went, right, okay, well, you keep that close by. And I carried on saying, okay, well, we need to go into this room and see what kinds of period features we can find. And then we talked about what period features meant. And I'm kind of cracking on with it. And when all of a sudden I hear this little beep, 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 beep coming from this little chap, I say, what's that? He says, it's my ghost busting machine going off. And I said, is there a ghost here? And he said, yes, it's that there. And I'm saying, that white thing there. And he's going, yeah, that white thing there. And all the children are going, woo. And I'm thinking, I really don't want this. This is not where my task is going. So I just said to him, hang on a minute, I'm the boss, so I'll step forward, I'll put myself in danger first and I'll go and see what it is. And I'm calling back to the children who are only about 3 feet behind me. Hang on, I'll touch it. I put my hand out and I went, oh, it's just a sheet, I'll pull it off. And I pulled it off and I went, grandfather clock, look at that, that's amazing. Look at this beautiful grandfather clock. And he's a little bit disappointed, but the children are like, oh, grandfather clock. So we best write that down in our best write that down and say that that's there and work out whether or not we need to remove it and send it to Jenny or what we're going to do with it. So the children crack on. They do floor plans for each of the rooms. We're talking about what is a drawing room, what is a scullery. And one of the children says there's a music room and puts a glitter ball in it. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm not really sure what about a glitter ball, but we might come back to that later. We were identifying what original features are in here. So we talk about cast iron fireplaces and oak wooden paneling. And you can tell here that what we're developing is the vocabulary for a piece of descriptive writing. And we get to the point where we're ready to do that bit of writing. So they map out, do a floor plan, and then write a description of the rooms that they've been looking at. And then we go upstairs. And we go upstairs and we see something that we're not expecting to see. I just narrate this to the children. I say they stand on the wooden floorboards at the top of the stairs. They look to the right, everything is dark. They look to the left and see a shaft of light coming from under a wooden door. This little boy suddenly goes beep, 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 beep. And I'm going, I don't know, maybe it's a ghost. Maybe we need to go and see. The children are clustering behind me. And then I just say to them, they opened the door slowly and stepped into the room. And there, sitting in a chair, was an old man. He looked at the children. Well, I didn't say children, I said he looked at the estate agents and he said, how do you pack 100 years into a suitcase? I can't do it. All around him are documents and photographs of a life. And on the bed is one empty old suitcase, and the children are in it. They're like, oh, you want to speak to the old man? I say to them, they're like, yes, yes. And I said, well, I'll speak as the old man. And they hot seat me, they ask me lots of questions, and we use that as a springboard to think about the history of the local area, because we've got 100 years of history to cover here. I know, and they are about to find out, that their primary school was a field hospital in World War I, which would predate this man's life. So we place his father there. His father and mother met when he was injured in World War I. She was a nurse. He was an injured soldier. They met at the field hospital, which was their primary school. How amazing is that? And then they bought the house that Bob was born into. They'd called him Bob, that he was born into. And we can start to unravel this timeline of his history, his apprenticeship at Camel Laird Shipyard, how he contributed to the building of some of the most amazing ships in the world, how in the Second World War he sailed off on one of those ships and sadly found himself being bombed by the Japanese off the coast of Singapore. And the children did some fantastic writing, diary writing about being in the sea, circled by sharks with Japanese bombers flying above, and how he didn't think he'd make it home, but he did. He made it home, and he married his Martha, and he and his Martha used to love ballroom dancing. They used to go to Blackpool and do all the ballroom dancing. But when she got sick, he put a glitter ball in their music room, and they danced underneath that until she couldn't dance anymore. So we introduce all these sort of elements of a human life unfolding before these children. And then, of course, the job of the children is, can they make him a memory box to take with him to his care home? How do we pack that 100 years of life into that suitcase? What we're going to do about the grandfather clock? You can't take that. Can we ship that to Jenny? And if you're going to ship a clock to Jenny to Australia, what's all the logistics of that? What does that involve? So we've got loads of calculations and things to do as well. But the most important thing is this community strand, because what we end with the children is, this is a story and this is Bob and we've helped him and that's amazing. But there are people like him everywhere, and there are people like him in our own community. So how can we connect with those lonely old people in our own communities and make them feel like they've got friends? So we couldn't go as far as we wanted to. This is just a stock photo. We haven't been able to go into care homes and hug old people. That's not been a reality in this past year, but we have been able to set up Zoom connections, story reading sessions. They've written letters, and hopefully one day those connections can be in person. So it's about, how can we take curriculum content, weave it in a way that becomes meaningful to children, but then take that even further into those community links, so that children feel like they've got the agency to do something about this problem and not just be introduced to it. And what we're trying to do here is to think about, what kind of pedagogical entitlements are we giving children here? We want them to cover all these areas, not just, the knowledge part of things, but to do things, to use their bodies, to create things. That's why we open the door, we stand with our torches, we create still images, we're physically engaging with the work. They're thinking, they're in the cognitive realm, they've got problems to solve, written tasks to do, reading tasks to do, but they're also sitting in this affective dimension where they're feeling it. They feel like it's got purpose. They feel that it's emotionally important to them. And they're working together, not just together as a class, not just doing group work, but they're connecting socially outside of the classroom with the local community. And it seems to me that when we're planning units of work with children, we need to be thinking about all four of these realms, and too often we just reduce it down to the cognitive realm. So how can we do this, and why do we do it? I think stories are the really powerful way to do this. We know now from cognitive science, and it's been developing, the evidence base has been developing for quite a long time now, that stories for some reason are psychologically privileged in the human mind, and that makes everything easier to remember. Curriculum information that's wrapped into a story becomes easier to remember. Now, I say that with a caveat, and it's just a personal thing, this, but I don't know about you, but hopefully you'll get a break this summer and you'll start reading novels, and then 6 months down the line, somebody will say to you, oh, what did you read? And you'll go, oh, that book was really good. And they'll say, what happens in it? And you'll go, can't remember. Yeah, it's set here and it's about this, but I can't quite remember. So it's not an infallible theory, but I think when you place children in the story where they're actually grappling with the story, they're finding almost the plot line themselves within that story, then it does become incredibly memorable for them. Now, Willingham talks about the idea that what's important about stories is that they have these elements. They have characters, people who are in complicated situations, and that gives the story kind of twists and turns of direction. And what that does, those two things, is our brains are drawn to people like us. So whether it's anthropomorphized animals or whether it's people, we pay attention when we see another person a bit like us in some kind of tricky situation. And what we've got to do as teachers is broaden out children's circles of empathy so that they see all people as a bit like us. And that's what we're trying to do as we do this. Then our brains are drawn to novelty. And so what complications and pivots and twists in direction give to the brain is this: I need to pay attention because this is something unusual, this is something new, this is something I'm not used to. Then causality is our brain's comfort with patterning. So when one thing leads to another, there's cause and consequence, there's chronology, there's a narrative structure. We find that quite reassuring in terms of our brains. But we're also highly tuned to tensions. We're looking out for danger all the time. That's what our brain's job is, to keep us safe from danger. So when we combine these things, they kind of like empathy connection, the novelty, the patterning, and the lookout, the observation that our brain has constantly for scanning for danger. We put them into a story, we get something really, really powerful. And so when we think about that, I think that stories are effectively forming a bridge of concern for children that takes them from one state of mind to another. And I just want to touch upon this, and I won't throw a lot more theory at you, I promise. I'll give you a couple more examples. But this comes from Dorothy Hefker, and I worked with her when I was a young teacher, and she came, and worked with us in school. She was an amazing educationalist. She was still going into schools and working with children in her 80s. So, she had this lifetime of wisdom to impart. And she'd asked us what we wanted out of our curriculum, and we'd said that we wanted the children to be more engaged. I was working with Howell Roberts at the time, and he was like, yeah, we just want kids to be more engaged. And she said, is that all? And we were a little bit like, oh, here's a guru, and we've just sort of, got her disdain. But she wasn't being disdainful. She just said there's a world beyond engagement. And she explained it like this. She said schools are really good at getting children's attention. They have routines, regulations. Children know where to put their coats. They know where to put their bags. They know where to sit. They know what routine there is in the morning. And the vast majority of children give us their attention. And then teachers are pretty good at getting children's interest. So they'll, have a starter activity or a modelled activity or a little experiment or an interesting image, to captivate children's attention. But then we tend to default to task setting. And if they do the tasks, we say they're engaged. And that can be a bit of a proxy for children just being compliant. So, they go to their tables, they sit down, there's some worksheets ready, they get on with it. Their final, full stop goes in just before the break because they know how to time it perfectly. And we all say, oh, that was great, that lesson. They were all engaged, but actually they were just compliant and they were playing the game of school. Or we pop our heads around a door and the kids are having an amazing time. They've got the glitter out, the glue sticks, they're making Viking shields, they're busy, 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 but they're just entertained and they're not really learning anything. So we too often talk about children being engaged or on task, but we're not really thinking more deeply. And all of that the responsibility sits on the shoulder of the teacher. So all of that is children being dependent on teachers for setting the worksheets, getting out the materials, getting the task sheet ready, printing off the twinkle, how to make a Viking shield sheet and all that kind of stuff. She talked about this idea of taking children over a bridge of concern. And when we take children over a bridge of concern, and for me, stories do that perfectly, they move into a different headspace where they become invested in the work. And that investment is demonstrated in them losing track of time, not wanting the lesson to end, wanting to go home afterwards and research things, bringing in stuff the next day, going, I saw this on YouTube, and sort of like handing it into you. Or I read this book, or my granddad said, or can we go, can we do? And when children are in that invested space, they start to move into more of an independent learning space, and they have more of a sense of agency. And she said, if children don't get to that investment phase, they never get to the obsession phase. And the obsession phase is the phase we're in when we decide what we want to do with our lives. And now most teachers don't see that. You don't see a kid, unless you're really lucky, and, you know, and 15 years later, you're in a supermarket and you bump into somebody who goes, hey, miss, do you remember when we did that unit on space? You'll never guess I'm an astronaut with NASA now. We don't see that. But if we don't get them to a point of investment, they never get to that point of obsession. So I've held that in my mind when I've been working through, and then layered this on it. If I want to introduce children to stories, what's helpful for me in planning? I think when I'm planning it, who are the people? There's an old man. Where is the place? He's in an old house, but he has to move to a care home. What's his problem? He doesn't really want to leave, and he doesn't want to leave his memories behind. What are the possibilities? Can we make him a memory box? Can we connect with our local community? You can see how that fits. So that's my kind of planning model that I share with teachers sometimes when we're thinking about how we can weave these stories into the work. So if I just give you a couple more examples before we finish very quickly. You know, we take a topic like the Victorians. We see on the national curriculum that we can do a history study that is post 1066, and most people tend to jump either onto the Victorians or World War II for that. So we have this topic, the Victorians, and it's massive. I mean, it's huge. And we've only got about 6 weeks, and we've got loads of stuff to pack in around it. So we're never going to get through everything about the Victorians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans. It's just never going to happen. So we've got to find a lens, a clear focus to look through in terms of what is this topic on the Victorians really going to focus in on. So for me, I decided that one of the connections that would be helpful for children is looking at childhood in Victorian times. How has childhood changed from Victorian times to today? And I started with this image, and we got the children to stand in the position of the characters in this image, and to get into groups of 7 and just recreate it. And then I just thought tracked them. What are these characters thinking? So to adopt the position of the man and the woman at the door, they've really got to think about what is being put into her hand. What is it he's got under his arm? Why are the children barefoot? What is the little boy behind them thinking? Because he's got a very surprised expression or a worried expression on his face. So we're starting to infer information from a text, and the children are then putting themselves somatically into that text. We then I say to them, would you like to ask anyone in this picture any questions? And let's ask the adults, because, you know, it's quite hard for a child to articulate their experience. So we'll ask an adult some questions first. And they're saying, we want to speak to that woman. So I sit down in the hot seat and they ask me questions. And I was really surprised, because one of the questions that first came from the children, they were, you know, kids who didn't mind speaking their minds, let's say. One of the questions from one of the children was, they'd found out that I was effectively selling my child to this man because I couldn't afford to feed my children. So one of the questions that the kids fired back at me straight away was, if you can't afford to feed children and you're having to sell them, why are you so fat? And I was a little bit taken back. I wasn't expecting it. I hadn't thought about the perspective of the person who'd drawn this picture. This is a historical source. It was in the Telegraph. It was an image that was presented in a newspaper of this particular practice of parents selling the children. And I'd not thought about how that was being framed until that child asked me that question. So I made up a little, answer about how, I think stress affects your weight and it can put weight on you and all this kind of thing. And then I just thought, I'm just waffling here. So I just came out of it and I said, you know what? I didn't expect that question. I was struggling to answer it. But what I'm thinking now is somebody chose to draw that mother like that. And why might they have chosen to draw her in that way? What, when you ask that question, were you disapproving of her? And the child said yes, because it seemed like she was taking all the food and her children are really thin. So we started talking and looking at Victorian narratives and modern day narratives about the undeserving poor. And we could look at some of the headlines from our own newspapers today about how some families are presented. It went off in a direction I didn't expect, but that's one of the beautiful things about this work, that children can introduce this. When I came back to refocusing it on what I wanted to focus it in on, we were focusing on George Brewster. And George Brewster was the last chimney sweep in England to die going up a chimney, and his death forced a change in the law. There was already a law that existed to say that children shouldn't be going up chimneys, but no one was enforcing it. And his death was the outrage that was needed to completely change the law. I decided we'd looked at him from the point at which he was sold to the point at which he's being asked to go up this chimney. He's getting probably a bit too big to be going up there, but his boss says he's got to go up there anyway. We get to the point where we are protesters outside of the hospital trying to make this change to the law. The children have made placards, they're protesting. I go into role as Lord Rochester, coming out of the Houses of Parliament and announcing to these protesters that we've been successful, that there has been a change in the law, and that George Brewster will be the last child in England to ever die of these terrible practices. And the children are all cheering and we're all very happy. And then I say to them, do you want to speak to the master sweep? Do you want to speak to the man who bought this child and led him to that fate? Now you know you've been successful. And they're like, yes. And they're full of vengefulness. They just want to tear a strip off this master sweep. So I'm going, no physical violence now. I'm going to speak as the master sweep. What do you want to say to him? And they're going, you lost, we won, you're a horrible man, but you'll never be able to do this to any more children. You're finished, all this kind of thing. And I just turned around to them and said, oh, you're happy now, but I won't be putting a roof over the heads of these boys anymore. I won't be feeding them, and neither will any of my colleagues. So now you've got tens of thousands of young people out on the streets because their families don't want them back. Some of them don't even know who their families are, and we don't want them. We're not going to give them jobs. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go away and buy some new brushes, some new mechanical equipment that can clean the chimney for me, and I'll be all right. But those children are now your problem. And so we've moved from a space of celebration into a space of, oh no, now what do we do with all these street children? And we can move into the space that Oliver Twist occupies. We can look at how those changes to the law had positive and negative consequences for children. And then the trend of philanthropy, the children's homes, Bernardo's, the Coram hospitals, and so on and so forth that emerged. And the children can design their own solutions to this problem. So we're then taking that into modern day childhood. What happens to children today who need a little bit of extra help, and does it differ around the world? So what I'm suggesting to you here is that using the story to get children to practice responsibility, and then putting in twists and pivots where they think they've done the right thing, but it creates another problem, is a way of just keeping this story moving and getting them to see that the world's a complex place and that things don't always have easy solutions, but we can still keep trying as we go through. So they've learned all these things about, the Victorians and how history connects. Because one of the reasons, of course, we were sending children up the chimneys in the first place is because of the changes to building regulations from the Great Fire of London. So we were able to make a bit of coherence between that Year 2 unit of work on Great Fire of London and this unit of work later on in Year 4 and 5 on the Victorians. We are able to do this knowledge aspect, but what we're doing is we're placing children in moments of moral dilemma, and that's what they're practicing alongside the work. And we do this because there's some more interesting research called the Batman effect, which I think is just the best name for a piece of research ever. But they call it the Batman effect because the researchers initially noticed it with very young children in nursery settings and early years settings, that when they put on a superhero costume, they demonstrated the capacity to be more resilient, to persist at difficult tasks for longer. There were all these kinds of things going on, and they went, what has that got to do with the superhero costume? Could it be that the children are trying to adopt the characteristics of the character that they feel they're inhabiting at this moment in time? And they've carried on and done more research, and they've found that for older children, the costume doesn't matter. It's adopting the attitude and the circumstance of the character that creates a shift in mind. For very young children, costumes and props can help very much to inhabit that space, but it's about practicing responsibility. Can you? I'm very sorry. There's a strimmer outside my window as well. Phones going off, strimmers going off. Now, I wanted to kind of just very quickly touch on a couple more things, but I'm just going to fly through them really rapidly. When I was asked to teach the Romans, it was at a point where, just before Black Lives Matter, but a point where there were lots of conversations going on around how can we not just introduce children to the concept of race through things like slavery, so that it's always like a deficit model, it's always a victim model. How can we introduce race to children in a way that they see positive role models? And I was just about to start teaching the Romans, and I had this in the back of my mind when I came across a conversation on Twitter between Mary Beard, who's like the leading classical scholar in the world on the Romans, and Aaron Banks, who's like one of the leading racists in the world. And he was complaining about the fact that the BBC had put a black soldier into one of its documentaries about the Roman times. And she said, well, no, that's perfectly valid, because we know there were 500 Syrian soldiers situated on Hadrian's Wall. We know that there was a black Roman emperor, Septimus Severus, who was from Libya. And I was like, what? I had no idea that there'd been a black Roman emperor. So I looked into it a little bit more, and I built a scheme of work around this for children. We started with a story. We started with a Syrian soldier who is homesick on Hadrian's Wall. He misses the blue sky of his country. He misses where he comes from. And the children are thinking about what it might be like to be away from somewhere you feel comfortable. And then we think about, what do we notice about this soldier once he's got all his gear on? And the children are going, they're not saying, oh, he's black, that's outrageous. They're going, oh, he's carrying a frying pan. Did he have to make his own food? Oh, and one child's going, oh, there's a shield to make a turtle formation in battle, and etc. They were commenting on what they knew and the questions they had. We looked at the extent of the Roman Empire so that they could understand that actually it was made up of many different cultures and nationalities. We introduced them to the idea of this soldier Theotechnos, and I deliberately chose his name Theotechnos because I wanted them to know that Greece occupied Syria before Rome did, and that these empires have occupied places throughout history. And obviously there's the recognition for the children of Syria being a place where people are migrating from now because of war. So the children are recording their ideas down. They're offering advice to Theotechnos. Should he run away? Should he stay? What are the risks and dilemmas that he faces? And then if he does leave, what is his journey back through Roman Britain going to be like? What will he see? What will he encounter? What was Roman Britain like in 209 AD when there was an emperor called Septimus Severus? So we've gone through these kinds of stories at this point. We've met the family along the way. The reason that little boy's face is rubbed out of the painting is that when his father died and his brother inherited the throne, or the empire, and was jealous of his brother, so killed him and then ordered everybody to rub out his face on pictures. So the children were absolutely captivated by that story. But we also need to look at other timelines along the way. So we looked at what it might be like to be a defeated Roman soldier going back after the Celts had sent Julius Caesar home with a flea in his ear. We looked at what it might be like to be a soldier watching a new Roman fleet coming across to Kent, a Celtic warrior, watching that advancing army coming over. We looked at what it might be like to be a friend of the daughter of Boudicca, worried about her brother being dragged into a war that she didn't think the Queen was going to win. We looked at what it might be like to be a villager in Northumberland in 122 AD, being asked to provide the labour to build a wall from one side of the country to another. We looked at Septimus Severus, and then we looked at what it might be like to be a soldier who'd finally finished his service, got married and settled in a village in England, and then was told that the Romans were going home. And what does he do? So all these stories come together to make one massive timeline for the Romans, and we're immersing children in that timeline. In this one, I'm sorry, is it all right, Helen, if I just go over like one more minute? Is that okay? This one was just, we started off with an image of a cave. We're explorers. We've been asked to go and help somebody find the cave that was drawn in this image. It's never been found. It's like a piece of fiction, but can we find it? We find it, we go in, we investigate it. It's beautiful. There are stalactites, stalagmites. There's an underwater lake. It's beautiful. But at the back of the cave, there's a sign that says, "Turn back. There are hands in the darkness. Should we go any further?" Some of the children are saying, "No, we're not going in there." And some of them are going, "I'm up for it. We're an adventurer." So we crawl on our bellies under a table. We come out, we find the hands in the darkness, and we're in the Stone Age. And so we discover, who made these paintings? Who were these people? How did they live? How did they find the time to, dance and play musical instruments and make art when life was so difficult? How did they survive? And the children create their own exhibition and take their parents and local members of the community through there. Peter Thoneman, a professor of ancient history at Oxford University, said it was extraordinary that children were just comfortable with epistemic uncertainty, he said, and that's something his undergraduates at Oxford struggle with. They were taking them through in a tour, but this is what the parents said at the end. And I just want to leave us with this, really, in terms of nobody ever goes into teaching to make a child feel stupid. Nobody does that. And yet this child felt stupid, and the teacher hasn't changed. All we've changed is the way we approach curriculum, and it has given this child this sense of empowerment. Now, I could go on for another half an hour, and, I did have other stories to share with you, but I've waffled on too much and left it too late. So I'm going to stop there. But if you do have any more questions, obviously, I'm happy to stay on and chat, and you can pop them into the chat. I'll stop sharing now and just hand back. But I'm here if you want me to stay.
That was inspiring, and huge amounts of ideas. And I think at this end of term, it's really lovely to think about the curriculum and opportunities for next year. And hopefully colleagues will be able to go back and share this recording or share some of these ideas with colleagues within school and take those ideas forward. It's so important, isn't it, to bring community and that coherence and that creativity, all of those things into the curriculum. And you've really sort of ignited things for us today. So thank you so much. And I hope colleagues have found that, inspirational, useful, something, nice at this time of year to look at and think forward in terms of curriculum planning for next academic year. So thank you so much, Deborah. I'm going to just quickly post the feedback link into the chat. As I say, hopefully you should have had that email to you as well. Our end of year evaluation is more important than ever in terms of giving us your feedback. If you have engaged with our webinars this academic year, tell us what you found useful. Tell us what you want us to focus on for next academic year. I'm pulling the programme together for that at the moment. Really excited by some of the speakers that we've got lined up already. So we've got Guy Claxton coming along talking about the future of teaching in October. We're also going to be joined by Hailey Hughes as well, looking at mentoring for schools. We've got Sir David Carter coming and talking about academisation, when it works and what, when it goes wrong, what might be the factors there, so we can consider those sorts of things. And Rachel McFarlane, who's just written a book called Obstetrics for Teaching, or for Schools, sorry, really inspirational lady. I was talking to her the other day, so really excited that she's going to come and share her thinking with us as well. So I'm going to leave it there, colleagues, because I know that your time is so precious. Thank you for being with us. Huge thanks, Deborah, for sharing your thinking today. It's been really wonderful to hear your stories and your thoughts, and really inspiring. As I'll say, I'll send the book voucher across to everybody again, and if you haven't used it already, please do go out and have a look at the curriculum of Hope and reflect on that over the summer. I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of more ideas in there. So I'll leave it for you today, colleagues, but thank you for engaging this academic year. I hope you have a wonderful holiday when it does come. I hope you do get a break, fingers crossed, if I can get things, you know, some advice and guidance to you before, in good time anyway. But please take that break and look forward to seeing you again next academic year. Thanks again, Deborah. Thanks, colleagues. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.